The taste never leaves your mouth. 3 months have passed since I crawled out of that basement. Blood under my fingernails and the screams of the dying still echoing in my ears. Yet I can still taste the metallic temps of terror that coated my tongue that night. You think you know what fear tastes like until you've watched human flesh being ground into hamburger meat? Until you've seen the casual efficiency with which monsters wear aprons and serve death with a smile. This is not another urban legend whispered around campfires or shared in online forums. This is the confession of someone who survived Butcher's Delight, the most popular hamburger joint in Millbrook, where the secret ingredient was never listed on any menu but satisfied the darkest hungers of a town that had learned to look the other way. The horror I'm about to share will challenge everything you believe about the places where you eat, the neighbors you trust, and the thin veneer of civilization that separates us from the monsters who walk among us every day. Tonight, as you sit safely in your home, perhaps with a late-night snack within reach, remember that evil often hides behind the most mundane facades. And sometimes the most popular restaurants in small towns serve appetites that go far beyond mere hunger. If you think this channel pushes boundaries, you haven't seen anything yet. Subscribe now if you dare to hear testimonies that most would rather forget. Stories that blur the line between nightmare and reality. Here's a question that will haunt the remainder of this tale. What would you do if you discovered that your favorite meal was made from someone who once had dreams, fears, and a name? The first person to answer correctly will receive a small reward from My The Storyteller tonight as a way of saying thank you for watching and supporting. Tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching and what's around you right now. I'm curious about the spaces where these stories find their audience, the quiet rooms and darkened corners where truth meets terror. But before we begin this descent together, know this: some hungers can never truly be satisfied. The job posting seemed innocent enough, almost laughably normal for what would become the most horrifying experience of my 24 years on this earth. A simple advertisement seeking kitchen staff for a family-owned restaurant that prided itself on serving the best hamburgers in 3 counties. But innocence has a way of rotting when you dig beneath the surface. And what I found beneath Butcher's Delight made me question everything. I thought I knew about human nature and the lengths people will go to satisfy their most depraved appetites. The first thing that struck me about Harold Grimm was how his hands never stopped moving, thick fingers constantly kneading invisible dough or grinding non-existent meat, as if his body had memorized the motions of preparation so thoroughly that it continued the work even when no work was being done. He hired me on the spot that Tuesday morning, his pale eyes scanning my resume with the same intensity most people reserved for reading scripture. And when he smiled, his teeth seemed too white, too perfect, like porcelain tombstones in a graveyard. "A flesh. Welcome to the family," he said. And the way he emphasized that last word made something cold crawl up my spine. Though I dismissed it as the usual awkwardness of small-town hospitality mixed with my own desperate need for employment, the restaurant itself appeared normal from the front tread vinyl booths worn smooth by decades of satisfied customers. Checkered floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights, walls covered with framed photographs of local high school football teams and county fair winners. All the trappings of Americana that made tourists stop their cars and locals feel proud of their community institution. But restaurants, like people, keep their secrets in the places customers never see. And it was in those hidden spaces that I first began to notice the wrongness that permeated Butcher's Delight. Like a stench that no amount of industrial cleaner could fully mask. The kitchen operated with military precision during my first week. Each employee moving through their tasks with a kind of silent efficiency that spoke of long practice and absolute loyalty to Harold's vision of perfection. But it was the sounds that bothered me most. The rhythmic thudding from below that happened every Tuesday and Friday night. The wet slapping noises that seemed to emanate from the basement storage area. And the way conversations stopped abruptly whenever I entered a room, as if I had interrupted something sacred and terrible. Harold kept the basement locked, explaining that the freezer units down there were industrial grade and dangerous for untrained staff to operate. But the sounds that drifted up through the floorboards during those late-night cleaning shifts painted A picture of activity that had nothing to do with frozen vegetables or bulk meat deliveries from legitimate suppliers. The other employee is Sarah, with her nervous laugh that never quite reached her eyes. Marcus, who spoke only in whispers and flinched whenever Harold entered the room. An elderly Mrs. Chen who had worked there for 30 years and seemed to know secrets that made her hands tremble when she thought no one was watching. All carried themselves like people who had witnessed something that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. The missing person flyers started appearing on telephone poles and storefront windows during my second week. Faces of young people who had simply vanished without explanation, smiles frozen in high school graduation. Photos and family portraits that would never age beyond the moment the camera clicked. Jennifer Whitmore, 19. Last seen leaving her job at the gas station on Route 47. David Chen, 22, disappeared after his shift at the auto parts store. His car found abandoned in the Walmart parking lot with his wallet and keys still inside. Maria Santos, 17, who never came home from her evening jog through Riverside Park. Her running shoes discovered muddy and discarded near the old bridge, where teenagers went to drink beer and share their first kisses. I counted 7 faces in total, all young, all healthy, all possessing the kind of robust vitality that made their disappearances feel like violations of the natural order. And as I stared at their photographs during my lunch breaks, something began to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness like a persistent itch that couldn't be scratched. The timing troubled me most. Disappearance coincided perfectly with Harold's Tuesday and Friday night basement activities. Those mysterious hours when the regular staff was sent home early, and only Harold and his most trusted employees remained to complete what he called special preparations for the following day's menu. Sarah mentioned it casually one afternoon while we cleaned the grease traps. How the hamburger meat always seemed fresher on Wednesdays and Saturdays. How Harold took such pride in his proprietary blend of proteins that he refused to reveal his supplier, even to longtime employees who had earned his trust in every other matter. The meat itself looked different on those days, darker and more marbled, with a richness that made the regular customers line up around the block for what Harold advertised as his signature Millbrook special, a hamburger so popular that people drove from neighboring counties just to taste what food critics had called the most authentic and satisfying burger experience in the entire state. But authenticity, I was beginning to realize, could hide meanings that polite society preferred not to examine too closely, and satisfaction could mask appetites that had nothing to do with conventional hunger. The delivery truck that arrived every Tuesday and Friday night bore no company markings. Just a plain white van that backed up to the restaurant's rear entrance where Harold and 2 men I had never seen before unloaded canvas-wrapped bundles. That moved with a weight and flexibility that reminded me uncomfortably of sleeping bodies, though I told myself that industrial meat shipments often came in unusual packaging to preserve freshness and prevent contamination. The basement door stood slightly ajar that Friday night, a sliver of yellow light spilling across the kitchen floor like a wound that refused to heal. And through that narrow gap came sounds that belonged in nightmares rather than in the depths of a family restaurant where children celebrated birthdays and couples shared their first dates. I had stayed late to finish inventory, Harold having left hours earlier with his usual reminders about locking up properly and keeping the basement strictly off limits. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the sounds that drifted upward, chopping punctuated by mechanical grinding and the occasional splash of liquid hitting concrete, drew me toward that forbidden threshold like a moth to a flame that would surely burn. The stairs descended into a world that existed in deliberate opposition to the cheerful normalcy above. Concrete walls stained with substances that formed abstract patterns in shades of rust and brown. Industrial lighting that cast harsh shadows across surfaces designed for function rather than comfort, and the overwhelming smell of meat and metal that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils with each breath I took. 3 stainless steel tables dominated the center of the room, their surfaces scarred by years of use, while along the walls stood equipment that belonged in a professional butcher shop: band saws, meat grinders, and hanging hooks arranged with the precision of surgical instruments, each piece maintained with obsessive care and positioned for maximum Efficiency in whatever grisly work took place in this underground chamber, but it was the human body on the nearest table that stopped my heart and sent ice shooting through my veins. A young man I recognized from one of the missing person flyers, his face peaceful in death, but his body partially dismantled with clinical precision. The work interrupted as if the butcher had stepped away for just a moment and would return to complete the transformation from person to product. Plastic containers lined shelves along the far wall, each labeled with dates and portion sizes, filled with cuts of meat that had once been someone's child, someone's sibling, someone's love. And in that moment I understood why Harold's hamburgers tasted so different, why customers drove for miles to experience flavors they couldn't find anywhere else, and why the basement had remained locked to all but the most trusted members of his inner circle. The mechanical grinder hummed in the corner, its feed chutes still stained with evidence of recent use.
Ow.
While nearby, a collection of personal effects watches, jewelry, wallets sat arranged in neat piles like trophies taken from conquered prey, mementos of lives that had been reduced to nothing more than ingredients in Harold's secret recipe for success. The footsteps on the stairs behind me carried the weight of inevitability, each measured step announcing Harold's return with the calm certainty of a predator who had discovered an intruder in his carefully constructed lair. And as I turned to face him, I saw not the jovial restaurant owner who had welcomed me into his family just weeks before, but something far more ancient and hungry that wore his face like a mask designed to fool the innocent and unwary. "Well now," Harold said, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he used when discussing daily specials with customers. "It seems we have a problem that needs solving," and the way his thick fingers flexed and unflexed told me that he had solved similar problems many times before with the same methodical efficiency he brought to every aspect of his business operations. Behind him stood Marcus and two other men I recognized as the mysterious delivery crew, their expressions blank with the practiced indifference of people who had witnessed enough horror to become numb to its effects. And I realized that my coworkers had not been innocent bystanders, but willing participants in Harold's grotesque enterprise, complicit in crimes that transformed neighbors into meat and hunger into something far more sinister than simple appetite. "You should have stayed upstairs," Harold continued, stepping into the basement with movements that reminded me of a butcher approaching livestock. "But curiosity killed more than just cats in this business, and now we need to decide what to do. With you before the health inspector arrives for his monthly visit and starts asking uncomfortable questions about our special ingredients." The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward with claustrophobic intensity as the four men spread out to block any possible escape route, their coordinated movements speaking of long practice in containing victims who had discovered too much about the true nature of Butcher's Delight's success story. "Run," my mind screamed, though my legs felt rooted to the blood-stained concrete floor. Paralyzed by the magnitude of horror I had uncovered and the dawning realization that I had stumbled into something far larger and more organized than a simple case of murder, something that involved careful planning, regular schedules, and a customer base that either didn't know or didn't care about the source of their favorite meals. Harold reached for a meat cleaver hanging from his belt, the blade catching the harsh overhead light with a gleam that spoke of recent use and meticulous maintenance, while his pale eyes studied me with the same calculating assessment he might give to a side of beef. Measuring weight and considering the best approach for maximum yield with minimum waste, the emergency sprinkler system activated when I grabbed the industrial torch from Harold's workbench and aimed it at the smoke detector, flooding the basement with cascading water that turned the blood-stained floor into a treacherous skating rink and created enough chaos for me to bolt toward. What, I hoped, was another exit hidden behind the maze of refrigeration units and storage racks that filled the back portion of the underground chamber. Harold's roar of fury followed me into the labyrinthine network of tunnels that extended far beyond what any normal restaurant would require. A subterranean complex that spoke of decades of careful expansion and modification designed to accommodate an operation that processed far more than beef and pork for the customers dining innocently above our heads. The tunnels branched in multiple directions, some leading to additional preparation rooms where hanging meat displayed the unmistakable proportions of human limbs. others opening into storage areas where personal belongings sorted by size and value created a museum of lives that had been reduced to inventory numbers in Harold's ledgers of consumption and profit. My footsteps echoed against concrete walls that wept with condensation and something darker that I'd preferred not to identify. While behind me the sounds of pursuit grew closer as Harold and his accomplices navigated their familiar domain with the confidence of hunters who knew every twist and turn of their carefully constructed killing maze. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red tones that made the hanging meat appear to writhe with residual life. And more than once I had to bite back screams when my hands touched surfaces that felt uncomfortably warm and yielding. Reminders that some of Harold's inventory was fresher than others and still retained the heat of recently extinguished life. One tunnel led to what appeared to be a dining room decorated with photographs of satisfied customers, their faces glowing with the contentment of people enjoying exceptional meals. And I realized with sick certainty that some patrons knew exactly what they were consuming, that Harold's enterprise served not just the unknowing masses, but also a select clientele who paid premium prices for experiences that catered to appetites society had forgotten how to acknowledge. The pursuit grew closer as I stumbled through the darkness, Harold's voice echoing from multiple directions as he coordinated his team's efforts to corner their escaped prey. His words carrying the casual professionalism of someone discussing the most efficient method for processing livestock rather than hunting another human being through tunnels that reeked of death and industrial disinfectant designed to mask the evidence of systematic atrocity. The ornate wooden door at the end of the furthest tunnel opened onto a scene that redefined my understanding of human depravity. A dining room that existed in deliberate contrast to the industrial horror of the preparation areas, furnished with crystal chandeliers and mahogany tables where well-dressed patrons sat savoring meals, while engaging in conversations that treated cannibalism as nothing more than an exotic culinary preference worthy of refined discussion and careful wine pairings. The diners looked up from their plates with mild annoyance at my intrusion rather than shock or horror, their faces displaying the kind of entitled irritation wealthy people reserve for service interruptions that threaten to diminish their carefully orchestrated experiences. And I realized that these were not victims of Harold's deception, but willing participants in an economy that transformed human suffering into gourmet entertainment for those who could afford to indulge their darkest fantasies. A woman in pearls delicately cut into what I now recognized as human flesh, prepared with the same attention to presentation that fine restaurants lavished on their most expensive offerings. While her companion discussed the subtle differences between various ages and genders, with the expertise of a sommelier describing vintage wines. Their clinical detachment more terrifying than any display of savage hunger would have been. The Maître approached with the kind of professional courtesy that expensive establishments use to handle awkward situations, his expression suggesting that my blood-soaked appearance was merely a breach of dress code rather than evidence of a life-or-death struggle against organized cannibalism. And he politely inquired whether I required assistance finding my table or if perhaps I was looking for the restroom to freshen up before joining the evening's festivities. Harold's voice echoed from the tunnels behind me as his search party drew closer. But the dining room's patrons continued their meals with the studied indifference of people who had paid substantial sums for experiences that included occasional dramatic interruptions, treating my terror as dinner theater designed to enhance the authenticity of their transgressive evening out. The menu displayed on an easel near the entrance listed cuts and preparations with the same clinical precision found in high-end steakhouses, describing the provenance and characteristics of various offerings in language that sanitized murder into cuisine, transforming the violation of human dignity into a consumer choice for people wealthy enough to purchase experiences that existed beyond the boundaries of law and conscience. The ventilation shaft above the kitchen led to a storage room where 3 other people huddled in the darkness, their eyes reflecting the same wild terror that I felt coursing through my own veins. And as we whispered hurried introductions, I learned that Jennifer Whitmore had been captive for 2 weeks, David Chen for nearly a month, and Maria Santos had somehow survived in this nightmare for 6 weeks by learning Harold's routines and avoiding the twice-weekly selections that determined whose turn had come to provide ingredients for the restaurant's special occasions. They had survived by becoming invisible, by learning to read the subtle signs that indicated when Harold and his crew would descend into the tunnels to collect their next victim, and by discovering which hiding spots offered temporary safety. In a facility designed to eliminate any possibility of escape for those unlucky enough to discover its true purpose. Jennifer's left arm bore bite marks that she explained came from Harold's practice of sampling his inventory while it was still alive. A quality control measure that ensured only the freshest meat reached the tables of his most discerning customers. While David limped from an injury sustained during his initial capture when Harold's delivery crew had mistaken his resistance for the kind of spirit that would enhance the flavor of their final product. Maria had lost weight during her captivity, but retained the sharp intelligence that had helped her map the facility's layout and identify the patterns in Harold's operation, knowledge that she shared with desperate efficiency as footsteps echoed closer through the maze of tunnels that connected this hidden world to the cheerful restaurant above, where unsuspecting families enjoyed his meals that would haunt their dreams if they ever learned the truth about their favorite dining destination. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they expand the search to this section," Maria whispered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned survival in circumstances that stripped away every comfortable illusion about human nature and reduced existence to its most primitive calculations of predator and prey. The plan she outlined was simple in its desperation: create enough chaos in the main dining area to force Harold's attention upward while we attempted to reach the loading dock where the unmarked delivery truck still sat with keys dangling from the ignition, an escape route that required perfect timing and the kind of luck that seemed unlikely to favor people who had already been selected for consumption by monsters who wore human faces and served death with elegant presentation. The preparation room that separated us from freedom contained machinery that transformed the act of murder into an industrial process. Conveyor belts that moved bodies through various stages of dismemberment with the same efficiency Henry Ford had brought to automobile manufacturing. Except here the assembly line served purposes that would have made the great industrialist vomit his last meal onto his perfectly polished factory floors. Bone saws hummed with mechanical precision as they separated joints and portions according to Harold's exacting specifications, while hydraulic presses crushed skulls and rib cages into manageable fragments that could be disposed of in ways that left no trace for investigators who might eventually stumble onto this underground empire of organized cannibalism and systematic murder disguised as innovative food service. The grinding machines that dominated the center of the room bore manufacturer labels from companies that specialized in commercial food processing equipment. Legitimate businesses that had no idea their products were being used to transform missing persons into hamburger meat for customers who praised Harold's secret blend without ever suspecting they were consuming their neighbors, their children's classmates, and the young people who had simply been in the wrong place when Harold's procurement needs required fresh inventory. Jennifer gagged as we crept between the machines, her hand pressed against her mouth to muffle sounds that might alert the search teams to our location. While David's breathing grew ragged from the infection that had developed in his untreated injuries, complications that Harold would normally address by accelerating a victim's processing schedule rather than providing medical care that might interfere with the flavor profile he had spent years perfecting. The temperature in the room hovered just above freezing to preserve freshness while preventing the complete solidification that would make the machinery less effective, creating an environment that felt like walking through a refrigerated nightmare, where every surface had been designed to facilitate the efficient conversion of human beings into consumable products that would satisfy appetites most people didn't know they possessed. Maria pointed toward a maintenance tunnel that ran parallel to the main preparation area, a narrow passage that service technicians used to access the machinery's electrical and hydraulic systems. And as we crawled through the cramped space, could hear Harold's voice directing his team's search with the calm professionalism of a manager, coordinating employee activities during a busy dinner rush. His tone suggesting that escaped inventory was merely another operational challenge to be solved through proper application of systematic procedures and experienced staff. The maintenance tunnel emptied into the restaurant's main kitchen, where the evening shift continued, preparing regular menu items with practiced efficiency. their movements choreographed around the knowledge that something unusual was happening. In the basement, but trained by years of employment to focus only on their assigned tasks and ignore any sounds or situations that didn't directly relate to serving customers, who expected their meals delivered promptly and prepared to Harold's exacting standards. Sarah looked up from the grill with startled recognition as we emerged from behind the industrial dishwasher, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and finally, a resigned sadness that told me she had witnessed this scene before, had seen other escapees make desperate attempts to reach freedom, only to be recaptured and processed with the same methodical attention Harold brought to every aspect of his business operations. The dining room beyond the kitchens, swinging doors buzzed with normal conversation as families celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, while consuming meals that might or might not contain ingredients that had once possessed names, dreams, and people who loved them enough to file missing person reports with police departments that seemed remarkably ineffective at solving disappearances in Millbrook's jurisdiction. Jennifer pointed toward the rear exit that led to the loading dock. But between us and that doorway sat 30 tables of satisfied customers who had no idea they were dining in a facility that processed human beings with the same casual efficiency. Most restaurants reserved for cattle and pigs, their ignorance protecting them from truths that would transform their favorite meals into sources of lifelong trauma and sleepless nights filled with questions about every bite they had ever swallowed. In Harold's establishment, the normal sounds of restaurant service, clinking silverware, cheerful conversation, the hiss of meat hitting hot cooking surfaces created a surreal backdrop for our desperate flight, reminding us that horror often exists parallel to normalcy, separated by nothing more than a swinging door and the willingness of people to avoid asking uncomfortable questions about experiences that bring them pleasure. Marcus appeared in the doorway leading from the basement stairs, his eyes scanning the kitchen with the methodical attention of someone conducting a routine security check rather than hunting escaped victims. And his casual demeanor suggested that this scenario had played out enough times before that it had become just another aspect of his job responsibilities at an establishment that specialized in serving the darkest appetites of a community that had learned to appreciate Harold's unique contributions to local dining culture. Harold emerged from the imperiate basement with the unhurried confidence of a proprietor addressing a minor service disruption, his apron freshly changed and his hands scrubbed clean of evidence. And as he surveyed the kitchen, his pale eyes held the calculating assessment of a businessman evaluating the potential impact of escaped inventory on his carefully maintained reputation for excellence and discretion among clientele who paid premium prices for experiences that couldn't be obtained through conventional channels. "You're making this more complicated than necessary," he said, his voice carrying the reasonable tone of someone explaining obvious facts to children who lack the experience to understand adult realities. "And I want you to know that cooperation, at this stage, could still result in arrangements that benefit everyone involved, including families who might prefer closure to the uncertainty of wondering what happened to their missing loved ones." Behind him stood Mrs. Chen, her elderly face displaying none of the trembling fear I had observed during our shifts together, replaced instead by the calm competence of someone who had spent decades perfecting her role in an operation that required absolute loyalty and unquestioning participation from every member of Harold's carefully selected team of employees who understood that certain aspects of their work never appeared in official job descriptions or employee handbooks. "The restaurant has served this community for 47 years, Harold continued, moving between the prep stations with proprietary familiarity, providing employment, supporting local suppliers, and offering dining experiences that bring families together for celebrations that create lasting memories. And you need to understand that your individual concerns about our methods pale in comparison to the broader benefits. We provide 200s of satisfied customers who depend on us for their most important occasions." His words carried the rehearsed quality of a speech delivered to previous escapees, a rationalization that transforms systematic murder into community service by focusing on economic benefits rather than moral implications. Harold had convinced himself that his operation served a greater good that justified the means through which he achieved his success in an industry where most establishments struggled to maintain profitability. Jennifer stepped backward toward the exit. But Harold's gesture stopped her movement with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience from people, who had learned that resistance only delayed inevitable outcomes determined by forces beyond their control. And his smile contained the patient condescension of a teacher explaining basic concepts to students who refused to accept simple truths about how the world actually operated beneath its facade of civilized behavior. The fire alarms. Piercing. Shrieks split the night air as we burst through the loading dock doors into the parking lot where Harold's unmarked delivery truck sat like a white metal promise of salvation, its engine still warm from evening deliveries that had brought fresh inventory to feed the machinery of systematic horror that operated beneath Millbrook's most beloved family restaurant. David fumbled with the keys while Jennifer and Maria threw themselves into the cargo area, their movements frantic with the desperation of people who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether they lived to expose Harold's operation or join the countless victims whose remains had been served as daily specials to customers, who praised the restaurant's commitment to quality and authentic flavors. The truck lurched forward as Harold and his crew poured from the building like angry hornets defending their nest, their coordinated pursuit suggesting years of practice in containing security breaches that threatened to expose an enterprise built on the systematic transformation of missing persons into gourmet dining experiences for clientele who appreciated culinary adventures that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional morality. Main Street stretched before us like a corridor lined with witnesses who remained obliviously asleep in houses where families trusted their neighbors and believed their community was safe from the kinds of horrors that happened in distant cities, rather than in small towns where everyone knew everyone and local businesses were pillars of civic pride and economic stability. Harold's voice crackled through a radio system that connected him to other vehicles now joining the pursuit, and I realized that his operation extended far beyond a single restaurant, encompassing a network of suppliers, distributors, and customers, who formed an underground economy that treated human trafficking as just another aspect of the food service industry's supply chain management. The truck's headlights illuminated street signs that pointed toward highways leading to larger cities, where anonymous police departments might take seriously reports of cannibalistic restaurants operating with the tacit approval of local authorities, who had been corrupted by bribes or blackmailed into silence by evidence of their own participation in Harold's special dining experiences. Behind us, the pursuit vehicles gained ground as their drivers demonstrated the kind of familiarity with local roads that came from years of conducting similar chases through neighborhoods where residents had learned to ignore unusual nighttime activities and sirens that stopped abruptly rather than continuing to their logical destinations at police stations or hospitals equipped to handle emergency situations. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed with the same mechanical indifference. I learned to associate with institutional settings designed to process people rather than help them. And as Officer Bradley listened to our frantic account of Harold's operation, his expression shifted from professional skepticism to something that looked uncomfortably like hunger rather than the outrage and immediate action that should have followed revelations about systematic cannibalism operating in his jurisdiction. "You're describing some pretty serious allegations," he said, his thick fingers drumming against the desk with the same restless rhythm I had observed in Harold's hands during my first interview, and we'll need substantial evidence before we can move forward with investigations that might damage the reputation of established businesses that employ significant portions of our community and contribute substantially to local tax revenues. Behind him, framed photographs displayed Officer Bradley accepting awards at various community events sponsored by Butcher's Delight. His smiling face captured alongside Harold's and images that documented years of collaboration between law enforcement and the restaurant that had become synonymous with Millbrook's identity as a destination for travelers seeking authentic dining experiences. Unavailable in chain establishments or corporate franchises, the other officers who gathered to hear our testimony displayed the same peculiar mixture of skepticism and interest, their questions focusing more on our mental states and possible motivations for fabricating such elaborate accusations rather than on the evidence we described or the missing persons whose disappearances correlated perfectly with Harold's operational schedule for acquiring fresh inventory. Jennifer's bite marks drew clinical examination from a paramedic who suggested they could have resulted from animal attacks or self-inflicted injuries, designed to support false claims against respectable business owners who had served the community faithfully for decades, without generating complaints from the thousands of satisfied customers who returned regularly for meals they considered the highlight of their dining experiences. David's infected wounds received treatment that seemed designed to sedate rather than heal. Medications that made his speech slurred and his testimony less coherent as he tried to describe the industrial machinery that had been used to process human beings with the same efficiency Harold brought to legitimate food preparation for customers who praised his commitment to quality ingredients and innovative cooking techniques. The station's holding cells contained to other people whose stories paralleled our own. Previous escapees who had been detained for their own protection, while investigations proceeded at a pace that ensured Harold's operation could continue, serving customers who depended on his establishment for celebrations that brought families together and created memories that would last for generations. The return to Butcher's Delight came not through choice, but through the cold logic of people who had realized that some horrors could only be stopped by those who had witnessed them firsthand. And as we approached the restaurant through service, tunnels that connected to the municipal water treatment facility, I understood that survival sometimes required becoming the very thing you feared most in order to protect others from experiencing the nightmare that had consumed months of our lives. The kitchen staff worked their evening shift with practiced efficiency, their movements choreographed around the knowledge that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power that governed Harold's operation. But their loyalty remained absolute, because they understood that complicity was the price of employment in an establishment that offered wages and benefits unavailable elsewhere in a community where economic opportunities remained limited to those who asked no questions and performed their duties without moral considerations. Harold stood in the preparation room supervising the processing of fresh inventory, his hands moving with surgical precision as he demonstrated proper techniques to newer employees who watched with the rapt attention of apprentices, learning a trade that combined culinary arts with skills that had no official names or training programs. And his voice carried the patient authority of a master craftsman passing knowledge to the next generation of workers, so would continue his legacy. Long after retirement or death removed him from active participation in the business he had built through decades of careful expansion and customer satisfaction, the machinery hummed with mechanical contentment as it performed functions that transformed the act of murder into an industrial process, governed by quality control standards and efficiency metrics that would have impressed legitimate food processing operations if they could overlook the nature of the raw materials being converted into products that satisfied appetites most people didn't know they possessed. Maria moved through the shadows with the silent competence of someone who had learned survival in circumstances that stripped away every comfortable illusion about human nature. Her knowledge of the facility's layout and operational procedures, now serving purposes that Harold had never intended when he allowed us to observe his methods through weeks of captivity that had been designed to break our spirits rather than educate us about vulnerabilities in his security systems. The plan required perfect timing and the kind of luck that seemed unlikely to favor people who had already been selected for consumption. But as Jennifer positioned herself near the main electrical controls and David prepared to disable the communication systems that connected Harold's operation to the network of suppliers and customers who formed the economic foundation of his cannibalistic enterprise, I realized that sometimes the only way to stop a monster was to become something equally ruthless. In pursuit of justice that existed beyond the boundaries of law and conventional morality, the flames that consumed Butcher's Delight painted the night sky in colors that reminded me of the emergency lighting in Harold's underground chambers. And as I watched 47 years of systematic cannibalism reduced to ash and twisted metal, I felt something inside my chest that might have been relief if trauma hadn't taught me that survival was just the beginning of a much longer journey towards something that could never quite be called recovery. The official reports blamed the fire on electrical problems in the basement storage areas, and Harold's death was attributed to smoke inhalation rather than the justice that had been served by people who understood that some crimes existed beyond the reach of corrupted legal systems designed to protect established businesses rather than their victims. And the insurance settlement allowed his widow to relocate to another state, where she could start fresh without the burden of questions about her husband's innovative approaches to restaurant management and customer satisfaction. 3 months later, I still taste metal when I eat anything that resembles ground beef. In grocery stores have become landscapes of terror, where every package of hamburger meat reminds me that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than most people imagine, maintained only by the willingness of ordinary citizens to trust that their neighbors share basic assumptions about right and wrong that may not actually exist beneath the surface of polite society. Jennifer works as a counselor now, helping other survivors navigate the psychological aftermath of experiences that have no names in conventional therapy manuals. While David has disappeared into the kind of anonymity that people choose when they realize that bearing witness to ultimate evil changes something fundamental in the observer's relationship with the world and everyone who inhabits it without suspicion or fear. Maria sends postcards from cities where she never stays long enough to form attachments that might compromise her ability to run if she ever encounters evidence that Harold's network extended beyond Millbrook's boundaries, reaching into communities where other entrepreneurs might have learned that certain appetites could be monetized by people who understood that consumers would pay premium prices for experiences that satisfied hungers they didn't know how to name or acknowledge. The new restaurant that opened in Butcher's Delight's location serves conventional food prepared by people who have never heard of Harold Grimm. But I notice how their hamburgers attract customers from neighboring counties who praise the meat's exceptional flavor and texture. Sometimes I wonder if destruction only scattered seeds rather than eliminating the poisonous. A tree that had grown in our community's shadow for nearly half a century. Sleep remains elusive in a world where every stranger smile might hide appetites that transform neighbors into meals, and trust into the kind of naivety that feeds monsters who wear human faces and serve death with elegant presentation. So if you're still awake, like this confession of someone who learned that evil often disguises itself as success, and subscribe if you want these testimonies to find others who need to know that some hungers can never be satisfied. It's only fed by those who mistake silence for safety. Some restaurants never really close, just change their names and find new locations, where the menu remains the same, but the customers never realize they've already been selected as tonight's special ingredients.